Hi there, Tricia Goyer here, and I am going to share some more behind the scenes about some of my World War II novels. Now, these are the first novels that I wrote, and I love sharing the stories behind them. I have another video that talks all about From Dust and Ashes, so make sure you check that out. But the next book I'm going to talk about is Night Song. All of these books are available at triciagoyer.com under shop, or if you go to Amazon, you can find them all there too, or Barnes and Noble, any of those places. So the idea for Night Song came when I was actually at the reunion of the 11th Armored Division, and I was researching for From Dust and Ashes. So the men from the 11th Armored Division, they didn't even know the camp was there. This was in 1945, May 5th, and a Red Cross worker approached them. This is all a true story. There's 23 Americans that were on reconnaissance, and the Red Cross worker led them to multiple concentration camps where they opened the gates. Germans surrendered them. It's just an amazing story. So, From Dust and Ashes is about the liberation, and I was interviewing a lot of the men who had been there at the liberation. Well, when I went to the reunion in Kalamazoo, Michigan, I remember I was talking to one guy, Leroy Peterson, who I call Pete. He was a dear, dear friend of mine, and he was telling me, he was a medic, that when the American jeeps rolled into the concentration camp and all these very thin, skeletal prisoners who were Jewish and Russians and political prisoners, they were celebrating, but then he heard the national anthem. So all of a sudden, he's in Austria, an American, and he hears the American national anthem being played by an orchestra. And I'm like, what are you talking about? And he said that they actually had an orchestra of prisoners inside Mauthausen and many other camps I learned later. There was many of the Jews were very well-known musicians, and the Germans, instead of just sending them to the gas chambers or putting them on work details, they would have an orchestra. So here inside this prison is an orchestra of prisoners that are well-known musicians, played around the world in symphonies, in orchestras, and here they are inside a concentration camp, and many of them survived because they were musicians. I started looking into it. John and I were able to go when we were in Prague to Terezin concentration camp, and it was there where many very wealthy Czechs from Czechoslovakia, that's what I mean when I say Czechs, they were musicians, they were doctors, actors, lawyers. They were told they were being sent away to a resort, for the Jews to go to this resort. Well, Terezin ended up being a camp where many of them went to. And then from Terezin, Hitler, when the Americans and British were hearing about these concentration camps, Hitler's like, oh, it's not really that bad. Let me show you. And so Terezin, which was a town, a camp inside a town, he ended up going and turning it into a model camp. He came and planted rose bushes. He set up restaurants, but it was overcrowded. There's families living, they're separated, and they're living in these homes, and they were walled in, and he cleared out 85% of the people that were there, sent them on to different concentration camps. Red Cross came in and said, oh yeah, you are taking good care of the Jews. It was totally a ploy. And a lot of those musicians and wealthy people ended up going to other camps. So Night Song, from that first premise from Pete saying, I walked in the camp gates at Liberation, there's an orchestra playing, I took it back to those wealthy musicians and wealthy people in Prague, Czechoslovakia, and to go through Terezin camp, and then I won't give everything away, but the liberation is in there. It follows a musician. Now, this book, the main character is 13 years old. He's a violin player. And when I was writing it, my oldest son, who's now 30, was 13. So I bawled my way through this book. But it was so amazing to be able to understand what was really going on, to learn more of history, and then to put it all on the pages of a novel. So that idea came from Pete. While I was also there at the reunion of the 11th Armored Division, I met other historians who were there, people from Holocaust survivors who were there. I got to interview them. People who had been in different countries where the men had liberated towns. They not only liberated concentration camps, but they went through France and Belgium and Germany and into Austria, and they liberated towns. They freed it from the Germans. And so a lot of people came to celebrate these men. Um, while I was there researching, I went back a second time to research more for Night Song to a second reunion. This one was in Buffalo, New York. A man came up to me and he said, "Now, I am not part of the 11th Armored Division. I was a World War II veteran. I'm here with my cousin, but I was in the South Pacific. I was in the Philippines. I was a prisoner of war of the Japanese, and I was in the Bataan Death March." He said, "Would you write a story about us also?" I looked at this man and said, "Yes, yes, I will write." I mean, just to be honored that in that way to write a novel, again, from these veterans, from their point of view. And I said, "Yes, I will write about the Bataan Death March." I had no idea. I had no idea because I'd been studying Europe. I had been studying concentration camps and Hitler's. I really hadn't studied the Japanese. So I ended up finding more information about the Bataan Death March, and I found out it was on the Philippines. Clark's Field was bombed only 8 hours after Pearl Harbor. So everyone who knows about Pearl Harbor, December 7th, 1941, Pearl Harbor was bombed, and that's how we entered into the war during World War II. Um, and many people didn't realize that other places were bombed, including Clarksville in the Philippines. They were bombed by the Japanese. And those men, those Americans who were at Clarksville, never had support come to help them. They were on their own. So, because most of the Pacific Fleet was bombed at Pearl Harbor, a lot of these men, they didn't have anyone bring them food or weapons. They held the island from December until April. And then they finally had to surrender to the Japanese, and they were put in camps. Americans were put in camps in the Philippines, and then some were taken to Japan. So I talked to that man that I first heard about it. I interviewed other veterans who had been there and had been part of the Death March. And Death March means that many, many, many men, many Americans, many Filipinos died on that Death March in the hands of the Japanese. But also, I heard some amazing stories too about, especially one man, Jacob Deschazer, who ended up was a prisoner of the Japanese and later went back after the war and became a missionary in Japan. So I'm hearing all these stories. I also researched pilots and women pilots, women who would ferry planes across the United States. So they go from factories to naval bases. Some women would work on the bases, on the Air Force bases. Well, they're Army then. It wasn't specifically Air Force, Army Air Force bases. And they would pool planes with targets behind it for the men to practice shooting. I'm just like amazed. So again, all these pieces are coming together. Was able to also hear the story of one man named Earl Williams, who just recently passed away, but he was flying in a plane into Pearl Harbor when it was being bombed. So I got to hear her story. All these stories tie together into Dawn of a Thousand Nights, and this is a thick book here that has female pilots, male pilots, that bombing at Pearl Harbor, prisoner of Japanese. All these things are tied into this novel. Which again, I just am so amazed that I had the opportunity to hear these stories and interview these men. So I was so fascinated with pilots during that time. I also learned that not only were women pilots for the first time in the military, for sure, they weren't officially in the military, they were connected to the military. Women were also war correspondents during World War II. It was the first time they were ever war correspondents. They were able to go into the fields, heard about these amazing women. He also interviewed men who were part of bombing crews in Europe during World War II. So again, you see how one book just leads to another as I find stories and connections. And I was able to interview men in our own hometown. I lived in Montana at the time, who had been part of bombing crews over Europe. And these bombing crews would go out again and again. Not only were they bombing Germany, um, they were getting shot at constantly, and to have survived until they were able to leave Europe is a miracle for so many people. And I also heard when I was in Europe about Lebensborn homes. Now, these homes where German young women would go and get pregnant to have babies for the Reich. Hitler wanted a 1,000-year Reich, and so these young German women would go to support the war effort and have babies for the Reich. So again, all these bits and pieces of stories are coming together. Well, this led to Arms of Deliverance, which there's a rescue of a child mixed in there. But Arms of Deliverance ties in war correspondence, bombing crews, and these Lebensborn homes. It also has some Jewish, I can't give everything away, some Jewish ties in there. But when I was working on this book, I was able to interview veterans. This was in the early 2000s. I was able to interview a lot of veterans, read a lot about war correspondence, but I couldn't find anything about the Lebensborn home that I needed. So there's one in Belgium, and I needed the setting to be in Belgium for certain reasons, which you'll find out if you read the book. But I couldn't find any information about this Lebensborn home in Belgium. There was a lot in Germany. There's some in other countries. There's one in Belgium. And I remember one day getting so like, I just don't want to make stuff up, especially if it's history. So I just like to research and hear the real stories and find out the real facts. And I couldn't find anything about this Lebensborn home. And I remember praying one day as I was washing dishes. So I'm like, Lord, you were there in 19, I think this book is set in 1943, right around there. I said, you were there during this time. Like, like, point me to the right direction. And it wasn't a couple hours later that I was heading back to my desk to work, and I remembered I knew somebody in Belgium. Like maybe he could research information. And I had met him at the Second World War II reunion. And so his name was Roger, and I emailed like, "Hey Roger, I don't know if you remember me, but in fact we still correspond even now." And I said, "I want to know about this Lebensborn home. There's only one in Belgium. Maybe you could Google. I don't think there was Google back then, but look up information for me on this Lebensborn home." He ended up writing me back within 24 hours. He goes, "Yes, I remember you. I've read the books that you've written about these men. You've done such a great job. And I would love to help you because where that Lebensborn home is my hometown. I know the lady who it was a museum, turned into a museum. I know the lady who runs it. What do you need to know?" So he was able to find out how many women were there, what the town was like, the layout of the Lebensborn home. I just remember thinking, I know one person in Belgium, and he lives in the town that has the place where I need the information from. And so overall, it's just amazing for me to hear these stories, to be able to tie these into novels, to connect the real history and make it come to life for readers. All my novels, there is war, there is concentration camps, but they're clean. There's, maybe my characters at the end might get one kiss, maybe, but it really goes into the real emotions of those time and what people were going through. So I know people always say, what age would this be good for? And I would say 13 and up. Some people, younger kids that have love World War II and know more about those things, younger would be okay too. But they can learn so much history going through these novels. If they went through, Dawn of a Thousand Nights for World War II, um, you know, learning about World War II, a student can learn about pilots and Pearl Harbor, Japanese, what was happening in the Philippines, so many things in one novel. So that's just even more behind the scenes of my novels. And um, I just am so honored to be able to write them. And I love all the veterans that I've met. I'm so glad that I had that chance to hear their stories and to put them into books that people can learn more about what really happened in history. Again, you can find out information about all my books just on my website, triciagoyer.com. And there's a little button that says shop. All my books are available there, or amazon.com, barnesandnoble.com, any of those places too. Thank you.